The Untold Story of the Harlem Tankers Part 1. Iron and Wealth South Carolina Dust. Acrid and choking, ate into the lungs, mingling with sweat and the smell of lubricating oil. Camp Claiborne in 1944 was a world unto itself, a world built on discipline, hard work, and humiliating, unfair segregation. Here, on this patch of land the U.S. Army had set aside for colored tankers, the 761st Battalion prepared to be sent to the front. They were called the Black Panthers, their emblem a ferocious black cat poised to spring adorn the turrets of their Sherman tanks. Their motto, written in bold beneath it, was a warning and a promise. Come out fighting. The company commander, First Lieutenant Jackie Robinson, a future baseball legend, clenched his fist so hard his bones whitened. But not because of the rigors of training. He was choked by the rage of disenfranchisement. He, a selected officer, couldn't enter the white officer's mess. His soldiers, excellent mechanics and gunners, could be insulted in front of the entire formation. The army they had joined to defend their country viewed them as second-class citizens, as experiments. Prove that blacks can fight. This unspoken but pervasive message was felt by everyone. Robinson would soon be transferred. His rebellious nature and refusal to obey Jim Crow laws displeased the command, but the seed of disobedience in the name of self-respect had already been sown. His place was taken by other officers equally black, stubborn, and ready to prove their worth. Among them was Sergeant Warren Strong Creighton, a driver-mechanic whose hands seemed designed by God himself to fix the Sherman's finicky engines, and Private James Jimmy Leroy, a sharp-eyed country boy who became a gunner. For him, a tank wasn't just a machine, but an extension of his will. He studied its habits as one might study a wild animal respectfully, but without fear. The training was hellish. For hours on end, they drove their 30-ton machines around the range, practicing the coordination of Stalin's menagerie, as they called their platoons. There were shooting drills, night maneuvers, and digging trenches to hide the tanks. The white instructors, many of whom were skeptical of the very idea of black tank crews, gleefully noted the slightest error, hoping to ruin the experiment. But the Black Panthers didn't break. They knew that every mistake, every failure, wasn't just their personal failure. It was a stigma for their entire race. This knowledge was heavier than any armor, but it also forged them. Their Shermans were their homes, their fortresses. Inside the cramped iron, reeking of gasoline, gunpowder, and male sweat, social distinctions were erased. There were no Negroes or coloreds here. There was the crew, the gunner, the loader, the driver, the gunner, radio operator. 5 people whose lives were intertwined in a single skein of fate. They argued, they swore, they shared meager rations and photographs from home. They sang the blues to drown out the roar of the engine and dreamed of the day when they could prove to the world who they were. Finally, the order came to load. The trains carried them to the port. As they bid farewell to the dusty hell of Claiborne, they didn't know what lay ahead. But they knew one thing. They were leaving not as guinea pigs, but as a fighting unit. They carried with them more than just ammunition and fuel. They carried the rage pent up over years of humiliation, the pride, and the iron will to prove their worth. Not with words, but with fire and steel, their ship set sail from American shores, taking them from a country where they were strangers, toward a war where they would fight for a freedom they themselves had never fully enjoyed. They looked at the receding shore, and their eyes blazed not with fear, but with determination. They were Black Panthers, and they were going out to fight. Part 2. Steel and Fire Prints, October 1944. Not the bright lights of Paris, but a dirty, war-torn Alsatian village. The first battle. It fell upon them not with a roar of fanfares, but with the howl of the Luftwaffe and the roar of German self-propelled guns. The air, thick with the smell of smoke and death, was thick and alien. For the soldiers of the 761st, this was the moment of truth. All training, all theory, collapsed in the face of a true, merciless hell. They were thrown into the thick of the offensive near Mortigny. Their mission, support the infantry and break through the fortified defensive line. The Germans, experienced and fierce, met them with a barrage of fire. Anti-tank guns camouflaged in the rubble, Panzerfaust in the hands of fanatical Volkssturm. The very first minutes of the battle became a bloodbath. One of the Shermans, Bessie, hit a mine. Only 2 men managed to escape the burning city dot inside Sergeant Creighton's tank. Terrible. There was a deafening roar. Enemy shells struck the armor with a dry, crackling sound. The driver, a young man from Alabama, froze, his eyes wide with terror. Lead the way, soldier. Creighton roared into the intercom, his voice cutting through the din. "They won't kill you as long as you move. Jimmy, see that bell tower? To the left, over there. Howitzer." "I see it," Leroy responded, his eye glued to the sight. Shot, recoil, the smell of gunpowder filled the turret. After a second, the bell tower, where the German gunners were hiding, turned into a cloud of dust and bricks. "Yes," cried Leroy, and in his voice for the first time sounded not childish joy, but cold opinion of a professional. They learned to fight with precious blood. They learned not to make the front armor under the famous 88mm guns Tigers. Learned to use the relief, work closely with the infantry, which started white soldiers who did not want to accept support from niggers. But when the Creighton tank group covered you, the grenadiers ambushed you. By removing 3 machine gun nests, the attitude began to change. Courage had no color. Radis Grozny now proudly accepted the calls. "Black Panthers, we spotted Tiger in the forest. Need help." Their first encounter with the Tiger became a battalion legend. Aster's German heavy tank, impervious to frontal hits from their 75mm shells, blocked the road into the village. Several Shermans were already burning. The crew of Lieutenant Charles Thomas, one of the platoon commanders, made a decision. They rammed, or rather, launched a desperate maneuver. While the Tiger was traversing its formidable gun, Thomas's Sherman charged out from the flank at full speed, exposing its thinner side armor, but gaining the opportunity to fire into the side of the German vehicle. Jimmy Leroy, who was firing Thomas's tank's gun that day, fired accurately. The shell struck the side, and the Tiger was enveloped in smoke. This wasn't just a destroyed tank. It was the myth of invincibility they had dispelled. They moved forward. Through France, Luxembourg, they were tearing into the Siegfried Line in Germany. Their Shermans burned. Their comrades perished. They had lost friends in cramped iron cages, where death was instant and horrific. They witnessed the horrors of the concentration camps they liberated, and this gave their struggle a new, terrifying meaning. They weren't just fighting for America, which didn't love them. They were fighting against the absolute evil embodied in Nazism. 181 days of non-stop fighting, without rest, without respite. They became ghosts of war, smeared with diesel fuel and mud, their eyes seared by the fire of battle. They destroyed machine gun nests, clearing a path for infantry, crushed artillery positions with their tracks and dual German tanks. Their motto, "Come out fighting," became their essence. They emerged from every ambush, from every barrage, from every burning tank. When they entered Austria in the spring of 1945, they were no longer called an experiment. They were called saviors. The white infantrymen they protected wrote home, "Those guys from the 761st are damn heroes." When you see their Panther on a hill, you know you'll live today. They had been through steel and fire, and forged for themselves the strongest armor, brotherhood, and military glory. But back home, in America, no one knew about this yet. Part 3. Silence and Recognition, May 1945. Austria. The war for the 761st Battalion ended not with a salute, but with the deathly silence of their deserted barracks. They stood by their riddled, charred, but still living Sherman tanks. These vehicles were their comrades, their homes, and for some, mass graves. They had survived. But what awaited them across the ocean? The return was a blow to the gut. The ship that carried them back to the States was just as segregated as the one that had taken them to war. They were once again herded into segregated quarters, once again barred from the white mess halls. The heroes who had been through hell were once again simply Negroes, the difference between the free Europe they had helped liberate and their own unfree homeland was the painful dot at the New York train station. They were met not by a crowd of jubilant Americans, but by silence and indifference. There was no parade, no celebratory speeches. The history of the Black Panthers was buried in the Pentagon archives. Official reports recognized them as an effective unit, but no special awards or national recognition followed. Their heroism was inconvenient for an America still living under Jim Crow laws. How could black heroes be honored when they couldn't enter a whites-only cafe? In their very same military uniforms? Sergeant Warren Creighton returned to Detroit. He found work at an auto plant. His skilled hands, which had been skilled at repairing damaged Sherman tanks under fire, were now tightening screws on an assembly line. He hid his combat medals in a chest in the attic. Why were they there? At work, his boss, a white veteran who had served the entire war behind the lines, called him boy and paid him less than white workers. James Jimmy Leroy returned to his farm in Georgia. One day, he walked into a local diner, forgetting the colored entrance. He was thrown out with a beating. The same man who had destroyed a German Tiger tank was unable to stand up for himself in his hometown. He withdrew, stopped talking about the war. At night, he had nightmares, not the sound of exploding shells, but the faces of white Americans. Grinning in hatred, they disappeared into life after the war. Engineers, drivers, postmen, workers. They built the very America that refused to recognize them as equals. They remained silent, carrying the memory of the war within them like an unhailing wound. Their brotherhood in arms became their personal, secret fortress. They met occasionally, corresponded, raised toasts to their fallen comrades. And in these conversations, a bitter note always rang out. Do they remember us? Do they know? The years passed. The fight for civil rights began. Martin Luther King and his followers took to the streets, and the veterans of the 761st, who had fought in a real war, saw echoes of their own in this struggle. They had fought the Nazi evil abroad. Now it was time to fight evil at home. Their voice was their former battalion commander, Colonel Paul L. Bates, a white officer who always believed in his soldiers. He spent decades collecting documents, writing letters to Congress, demanding recognition. He knew that the heroism of his men was not just a military success. It was an important part of American history that they had tried to erase. And finally, in 1978, 33 years after the end of the war, the thunder struck. President Jimmy Carter, under pressure from activists and thanks to the tireless efforts of veterans and their commanders, signed a decree awarding the 761st Separate Tank Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest collective award in the United States. A ceremony at the White House, gray-haired but straight-shouldered men in old but meticulously pressed uniforms. Their combat awards gleam on their jackets, which they could finally wear with pride, without concealment. The president read the citation for outstanding courage and heroism in action, unrivaled combat effectiveness, made an invaluable contribution to victory in Europe. Sergeant Creighton, now as gray as a falcon, stood at attention. Beside him, leaning on a cane, stood James Leroy. Tears streamed down their cheeks. These were tears not only of joy, but also of bitter relief. Justice, albeit 3 decades late, had been served. Their story had finally become national property. They were no longer unknown soldiers. They were the Black Panthers' legendary tank crews who, having overcome the hell of war and the ravages of racism, proved their valor. Their motto, "Come out fighting," became a symbol not only of their military journey, but of the entire struggle of African Americans. For their place in the American sun, they came out to fight, and they won, twice.